He needed me to be weak so he could feel strong. What Cameron did not know was that I was not in shock. I was prepared. 3 days ago, while he was busy ignoring my phone calls, I had already gone through the entire house. I had packed 2 duffel bags with my clothes, my important personal documents, and the few small keepsakes that truly mattered to me. I had hidden those bags up in the attic crawl space behind the holiday decorations. I knew this confrontation was coming. Diane had warned me during her final weeks in hospice. She knew exactly what kind of man our son had become. She knew he viewed people only as resources to be exploited. I had been waiting for him to make a move. This was not a surprise eviction. This was the opening move of a chess match he did not even know he was playing. Cameron cleared his throat, trying to regain the dominance in the room. He pointed a finger at the trash bags. He told me the developer wanted to start demolition prep by the end of the month. He said I had until Sunday evening to clear out my personal junk. Brooke walked back into the kitchen, loudly complaining that the upholstery on the vintage sofa was completely outdated and would not fetch a good price at auction. She looked at me with open disgust, telling me I should be grateful they were handling the heavy lifting of the estate sale. She said dealing with an old house was exhausting. I set my coffee mug down. I looked Cameron dead in the eye and agreed. I told him Sunday was perfectly fine. I said I understood that the house was too big for one person anyway. I kept my voice soft, compliant, and defeated. The relief washed over his face instantly. The tension in his shoulders dropped. He smirked, clearly proud of himself for executing this hostile takeover so easily. I only made one request. I asked him to just give me enough time to pack up my plumbing tools in the detached garage out back. I told him those tools were the only things I really cared about keeping. He laughed. It was a short, sharp sound of pure condescension. He told me to take all the rusty wrenches I wanted. He told me there would not be much room for them, in my new room at Silver Pines, but I could keep them in a box under the bed if it made me feel better. He checked his expensive watch, signaled to Brooke, and turned toward the front door. He told me not to drag my feet with the packing. He said they would be back on the weekend to change the locks. The front door slammed shut behind them. The silence returned to the house, but it felt different now. It was not the silence of grief anymore. It was the silence of a trap waiting to snap shut. I stood up from the kitchen island and walked over to the window. I watched Cameron's luxury sedan back out of my driveway and speed down the street. I left the trash bags on the counter. I left the assisted living brochure right next to them. I did not need to pack anything. Instead, I grabbed my coat and walked out the back door toward the detached garage. It was time to pull up the security camera feeds. It was time to watch my son commit a federal crime. I walked across the backyard, the cool autumn air biting at my face. I unlocked the heavy steel door of my garage. This was my sanctuary. It smelled of motor oil, cut wood, and 30 years of hard labor. I walked past my old workbench and went straight to the locked metal cabinet in the corner. I punched in the keypad code and pulled out my tablet. I had installed hidden high-definition security cameras inside the main house months ago, long before Diane passed. She had insisted on it. She said she caught Cameron snooping through her home office desk during Thanksgiving dinner last year. I sat down on an old wooden stool and connected the tablet to the secure network. I pulled up the live feed from the living room camera. I knew Cameron and Brooke had not just come over to deliver trash bags and threats. They had an ulterior motive. They needed something specific from the house, something they could not just take while I was sitting in the kitchen. I rewound the footage to 10 minutes prior, right before they walked into the kitchen to confront me. The screen showed Cameron standing by the antique secretary desk in the hallway, while Brooke was busy putting those ridiculous yellow sticky notes on the furniture. He was pulling open the small hidden drawer at the bottom of the desk. I watched him reach inside and pull out a heavy brass object. It was Diane's old notary stamp from her days working as a paralegal downtown. He slipped it into his suit pocket, looking around nervously to make sure I had not walked into the room. I paused the video. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. The bait had been taken. Cameron needed that stamp to forge a power of attorney. He needed to legally bypass the family trust so he could authorize the sale of the house to the commercial developer without my signature. He thought he was brilliant. He thought he was outsmarting an old grieving plumber who did not understand how the world worked. But he was just blindly walking down the exact path I had paved for him. I pressed a button on the tablet downloading the high-definition video clip directly to a secure encrypted cloud server. The eviction notice was just a distraction. The real game had just begun, and my son had just handed me the rope I was going to use to hang him. The cold glow of the tablet screen illuminated the dark corners of my garage. I sat perfectly still on the wooden stool, watching the live feed from my kitchen camera. Cameron moved with a hurried, frantic energy. He walked away from the hallway desk and carried Diane's heavy brass notary stamp to the granite kitchen island. He set it down with a loud thud. Brooke followed him carrying a carved jade vase she had just taken from the living room mantel. She did not look guilty. She looked impatient. She told him to hurry up before I came back inside. Cameron opened his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. The high-definition camera angle was perfect. I zoomed in on the screen. The bold black letters at the top of the first page were crystal clear. It was a general, durable power of attorney. He was not just trying to force a quick real estate sale. He was attempting a complete legal takeover of my existence. With that document, he could drain my bank accounts, empty my retirement funds, and legally sign me into a locked psychiatric ward against my will. He pulled a canceled check from his wallet. It was a check I had written him months ago to help pay for a vacation he claimed he could not afford. He laid it flat on the counter. He took out a blue ink pen and grabbed a scrap piece of paper. I watched my own flesh and blood practice forging my signature. He traced the loops and sharp angles of my handwriting over and over again. His face was entirely focused. There was no hesitation in his eyes. There was no remorse. My hands gripped the edges of the metal workbench so hard, my knuckles turned white. The primal instinct of a father is to protect his child from making a catastrophic mistake. Every fiber of my being wanted to march across the lawn, kick the back door open, and tear those fraudulent papers into 1,000 pieces. I wanted to shake him and ask him what happened to the boy I raised. But my rational mind took over. I knew exactly what would happen if I walked into that kitchen. If I stopped him now, it would just be a family dispute. He would deny his intentions. He would claim he was just preparing paperwork for my own good. He would play the victim, and then he would simply find another way to ruin me behind my back. I could not let him wiggle out of this. I had to let him cross the point of no return. I had to let him willingly commit a federal felony. I forced myself to stay glued to the stool. I watched the screen and let him seal his own fate. Cameron finished his practice runs. He slid the official document to the center of the kitchen island. He gripped the pen and signed my name on the bottom line. It was a perfect forgery. Then came the final nail in his coffin. He picked up Diane's brass notary stamp. My wife had worked for 30 years as a senior paralegal at a downtown law firm. She was meticulous with her record-keeping. She kept that stamp locked away because she understood the immense weight of the law. Cameron pressed the brass stamp hard onto the ink pad. He slammed it down next to the forged signature. He blew on the wet ink. A satisfied smirk spread across his face. He packed the fraudulent document back into his briefcase. He just bypassed the ironclad family trust Diane and I had set up 10 years ago. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He nodded to Brooke. They turned their backs to the kitchen and walked toward the front door. The camera caught his expression one last time. It was the look of a man who believed he had just won the lottery. I waited in the cold garage until I heard the heavy engine of his luxury sedan roar to life. I listened to the sound of his tires accelerating down the street until the neighborhood was completely quiet again. I tapped the screen of my tablet. The upload progress bar hit 100%. The high-definition video of his forgery was now permanently locked inside a secure, encrypted cloud server. It was evidence he could never delete and a jury could never ignore. I walked out of the garage and went back into the house. The space felt contaminated. I walked straight to the kitchen island and looked down at the granite surface. He had left a faint smear of blue ink near the edge of the stone. I wiped it away with my bare thumb. The reality of the betrayal settled deep into my bones. He truly believed I was just a broken old man who would fade quietly into the background. He thought his sudden strike was flawless, but a successful tech executive does not risk federal prison to illegally evict his grieving father unless he is drowning. His timeline was entirely too aggressive. He already had a commercial developer lined up to buy the property. He was desperate for a massive infusion of cash, and he needed it by the end of the week. I needed to know exactly why he was panicking. I walked into my bedroom and grabbed my winter coat. I pulled my truck keys from the dresser. I was not going to call the police. Involving the authorities right now would only freeze the property and drag the situation into a messy family court battle for months. I did not want a stalemate. I wanted total annihilation. I walked out to my heavy-duty work truck and started the engine. I backed out of the driveway and headed toward the city. I was going to see Fletcher, my private attorney. Diane knew what Cameron was capable of long before the cancer took her. She saw the greed festering inside him, while I was too blinded by a father's love to notice. During her final months, she secretly built a financial fortress that Cameron knew absolutely nothing about. She left behind a weapon designed specifically for this exact scenario. It was time to unlock the vault and show my son what happens when you try to bury a man who owns the shovel. I navigated my heavy-duty work truck through the midday downtown traffic. The city felt different today. It felt like a battlefield. I pulled into the underground parking garage beneath a towering glass office building. This was where Fletcher kept his practice. Fletcher was not just a lawyer. He was a shark dressed in a tailored suit, and he had been my private attorney for over a decade. I did not bother stopping at the reception desk on the 40th floor. The young receptionist tried to call out my name, but I walked straight down the mahogany hallway and pushed open the heavy oak door to his private office. He was on a phone call, but the moment he saw the look on my face, he hung up immediately. I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. I did not need to explain the situation. He already knew Cameron was circling like a vulture. Fletcher opened his bottom desk drawer and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. He slid it across the polished wood. This was the contingency plan. Diane had spent 30 years working in the legal field. She knew exactly how to structure an estate to protect it from greedy hands. She saw the darkness growing inside our son long before her illness took hold. She knew he would try to contest the family trust. So she quietly bypassed the trust entirely for her personal life insurance and her separate private investments. I opened the envelope and pulled out the crisp, heavy documents. The first piece of paper was a warranty deed. It was not for a small suburban plot. It was a deed to a 50-acre ranch out in Wyoming. It was completely paid off. The taxes were covered for the next 5 years. The property was completely insulated from any legal action Cameron could ever try to bring against me. Underneath the deed was a certified bank check. I stared at the numbers printed across the secure watermarked paper. It was for $600,000. Cameron thought he was leaving me destitute. He thought I was a helpless old man who would be forced to sleep in a cramped room at an assisted living facility. He had no idea his mother had secretly handed me the keys to an absolute fortress. I folded the check and slipped it into my inside jacket pocket. I felt a sense of calm relief, but it was quickly shattered by the expression on the face of my lawyer. Fletcher did not look triumphant. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on the desk. He told me he had done some quiet digging into the tech startup Cameron was running. What he found was not just standard corporate greed. It was a financial death spiral. Cameron was not selling my house just to be cruel or to upgrade his lifestyle. He was selling it because he was trapped in a corner and running out of time. Fletcher handed me a printed financial dossier. He explained that the company my son ran had lost its major investors 3 months ago. To keep the doors open, Cameron had taken out a massive bridge loan from a highly aggressive commercial lender. The loan was for $1.2 million. But a lender like that does not hand out millions without hard collateral. Cameron did not have any real assets of his own. So he used my house. He had already submitted fraudulent preliminary paperwork, claiming he had the legal authority to borrow against the equity of my property. That was why he was so desperate to finalize the sale and get the forged power of attorney on record today. The pieces of the puzzle violently locked together in my mind. Cameron needed the cash from the quick sale of the house to pay back the bridge loan before the lender audited his collateral. Fletcher looked me dead in the eye and laid out the timeline. The commercial lender had given Cameron an absolute deadline. Friday. If the $850,000 payout from the real estate developer did not clear by Friday afternoon, the lender was going to file immediate criminal fraud charges against him. He would not just lose his company. He would face a decade in federal prison for defrauding a financial institution. My son was not playing a game of real estate. He was trying to outrun a guillotine. I sat back in the leather chair and processed the timeline. Today was Monday. I had exactly 4 days to let him think he was winning. If I challenged the forged notary right now, the lender would find out and the police would be involved prematurely. Cameron might find a way to plea bargain or beg his way out of it with a lesser charge. I did not want him to have a chance to negotiate a settlement. I needed him to walk right up to the edge of the cliff on Friday morning, believing he had survived. I stood up from the desk and thanked Fletcher. I told him to keep his phone close and his schedule clear for the end of the week. I walked out of the glass building with the Wyoming deed in my pocket and a clear map of the impending destruction laid out in my mind. I needed to give them a target. Greed is a predictable poison. If Cameron and Brooke thought I was quietly packing away valuable assets, they would not be able to resist taking a look. On Monday evening, I drove out to an industrial stretch on the edge of town and rented a cheap ground-level storage unit. It was a rundown facility surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. The asphalt was cracked, and the security cameras on the main building were pointed at the ground. It was exactly the kind of place a vulnerable old man might use to hide his valuables. I loaded 5 heavy cardboard boxes into the back of the space. I had packed them with old rusted pipe fittings, damaged ceramic tiles, and heavy phone books. But on the outside, I wrote the word "Master Bedroom" in black marker. I secured the aluminum roll-up door with a standard combination padlock. Right above the door frame, tucked into the metal track, I attached a small battery-powered motion sensor camera. Tuesday night settled in cold and quiet. I was sitting in my dark living room, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. My phone vibrated against the armrest of my chair. It was 10:30 at night. I looked at the screen and saw the security notification. Motion detected at Unit 42. I opened the live feed. The night vision camera showed a figure standing in front of the corrugated metal door. It was not Cameron. It was Brooke. She was wearing a dark hooded jacket, but I recognized her expensive leather boots and the way she held herself with that impatient, nervous energy. She was holding a heavy cordless drill in her right hand. I grabbed my truck keys and walked out into the night. The drive took 20 minutes, but it felt like 5. My mind was completely clear. I parked my truck 2 blocks away from the facility in a dark gravel lot. I did not want her to see my headlights sweeping across the rows of orange metal doors. I walked the rest of the way on foot, stepping carefully to avoid the crunch of loose gravel. The night air was freezing, but I did not feel the cold. I slipped through a gap in the rusted fence at the back of the property and moved silently down the narrow corridor between the storage buildings. I could hear the high-pitched whine of the drill before I even saw her. She was bearing down on the cheap padlock metal shavings, falling onto the concrete beneath her boots. She was entirely focused on breaking into my unit. She assumed those heavy boxes labeled master bedroom contained Diane's diamond jewelry collection and the solid silver dining sets. She thought I was hoarding wealth that rightfully belonged to her and Cameron. The padlock finally snapped with a loud metallic crack. She tossed the broken metal aside and grabbed the handle of the roll-up door. She shoved the door upward. The metal track screamed in the quiet night. I stepped out from the shadows of the adjacent building. I held my phone up with the video recording light shining bright in the darkness. She turned around, startled, dropping the cordless drill onto the asphalt. But the fear in her eyes only lasted for a second. It was immediately replaced by a look of absolute contempt. She did not apologize. She did not try to explain away her late-night break-in. She just glared at the camera lens and crossed her arms over her chest. I asked her exactly what she was looking for in my storage unit. I kept my voice perfectly level. She let out a harsh, bitter laugh. She told me to turn off the camera. When I refused, she took a step closer. She said she was looking for what was owed to them. She said Diane's jewelry was being wasted on a grieving old man who was just going to leave it in a dirty box. She looked right at me and said they deserved a reward for putting up with my pathetic depression these past 2 weeks. She said dealing with my sadness was a massive burden on their lives, and they were simply collecting their compensation early. Her words were meant to hurt me. A few weeks ago, they would have shattered my heart. But standing there under the flickering yellow light of the storage facility, I felt absolutely nothing for her. I realized she was completely empty inside. She realized I was not going to move out of her way. She turned back to the storage unit and kicked one of the heavy cardboard boxes. The cardboard tore open, revealing the rusted iron pipe fittings inside. She stared at the junk in total disbelief. She realized she had driven all the way out here and committed a crime for a box of garbage. Her face twisted with frustration. She grabbed her designer leather purse from the ground and stormed past me. She aggressively shoved her shoulder into my chest as she pushed her way out of the narrow corridor. She was walking so fast and with such anger that she did not notice her purse had caught on the sharp edge of the broken padlock, resting on the concrete. The latch of her bag popped open. A few loose items spilled out onto the dirty ground. She did not stop. She just kept walking toward her parked car, cursing under her breath. I stood alone in the quiet corridor and watched her taillights fade into the distance. I looked down at the asphalt. Lying next to the scattered metal shavings was a crumpled piece of thick paper. I bent down and picked it up. It was an airline boarding receipt printed on glossy travel agency paper. I stepped under the dim overhead light to read the details. The names on the itinerary were Cameron and Brooke. It was for 2 first-class tickets. They were one-way tickets. The destination printed in bold letters was Dubai. I looked at the departure date and time. Friday evening at 9 o'clock. The pieces of the puzzle shifted again, revealing a picture far worse than I had imagined. Dubai does not have a standard extradition treaty with the United States for financial crimes. They were not just selling my house to pay off a bad corporate loan. They were selling my house to steal the $850,000 equity for themselves. They were planning to take the money, abandon the failing tech company, leave the commercial lender empty-handed, and flee the country permanently. They were going to leave me homeless and facing the wrath of a defrauded bank while they lived in luxury overseas. I folded the receipt carefully and slid it into my pocket. I closed the metal door of the storage unit. The deadline was Friday. I now knew exactly where they would be, and I knew exactly how to stop them. Wednesday morning arrived with a heavy frost covering the windshield of my truck. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine running, watching the exhaust turn to white smoke in the freezing air. I held my phone in my hand. I knew my son and his wife were planning to flee the country to Dubai on Friday night. I had the physical boarding receipt in my pocket. But knowing their escape plan was only half the battle. I needed to control their movements. I needed them to feel completely powerful and entirely safe right up until the moment the floor collapsed beneath their feet. To do that, I had to feed their arrogance. I had to offer them a piece of bait so tempting they would swallow the hook without a second thought. I opened my primary checking account application on my phone. The screen showed a balance of exactly $12,500. It was the account I used to pay the utility bills, buy groceries, and cover everyday expenses. I navigated to the wire transfer menu. I typed in the routing number for Wyatt. Wyatt was a tough, quiet man who managed the 50-acre property in Wyoming. He needed funds to repair a stretch of broken fence along the northern property line before the winter snow settled in. I typed in the amount of $500. For the transaction memo, I deliberately typed the word deposit. I pressed confirm. The money left my account instantly. I did not just make that transfer to fix a fence out west. I made it because I knew my son was watching every digital move I made. Weeks ago, before my wife even passed away, I had noticed small anomalies with my cell phone. Calls were dropping inexplicably. Text messages were showing as read before I even opened them. Battery life was draining rapidly. I am a plumber by trade, but I am not blind to technology. I knew my son worked as a tech executive. I realized he had cloned my SIM card. He had established full administrative access to my incoming messages, my bank alerts, and my private communications. He did it while I was distracted, sitting beside my dying wife in the hospice ward. It was a level of personal violation that still made my blood run cold to think about. I set my phone on this passenger seat and waited in the quiet truck. I did not have to wait long. I knew exactly how my son would interpret that $500 transfer to an unknown recipient. He would see the transaction memo that said deposit. He would assume I was finally surrendering to his demands. He would think I had just paid the initial reservation fee for the Silver Pines assisted living facility he had thrown in my face. He would believe I was packing my bags and preparing to disappear quietly into a retirement home just like he ordered. But my son was not the kind of man to leave a wounded animal alone. He was the kind of man who would take the last scrap of food from a starving dog just to watch it suffer. Less than 10 minutes after I sent the money to Wyatt, my phone screen lit up with a new notification. It was an automated security alert from my bank. A large withdrawal had just been initiated. I picked up the phone, opened the application again, and watched the screen refresh in real time. My balance dropped from $12,000 down to zero. The numbers simply vanished into thin air. I tapped on the transaction history. My son had remotely bypassed my security questions using the cloned phone access. He had drained every single penny I had left to my name. He routed the entire $12,000 through an encrypted digital gateway and deposited it directly into an offshore shell company registered in the Caribbean. He covered his tracks well, but the aggressive intention was painfully clear. He wanted to leave me absolutely destitute. He knew the commercial developer was pushing the house sale through by Friday morning. He knew that if I suddenly found my courage and decided to fight him, I would need money to hire a lawyer to file an injunction with the courts. By stealing my last $12,000, he was cutting off my oxygen. He was ensuring I could not afford legal representation. He was making sure I could not even afford a cheap motel room to delay the eviction process. He wanted me completely helpless, financially paralyzed, and entirely at his mercy. I sat in the cold truck and stared at the zero balance on the glowing screen. I was not angry about the stolen money. The $12,000 meant absolutely nothing to me compared to the $600,000 sitting safely in my lawyer's secure vault. But a cold knot of genuine concern began to form in my stomach. My son had just created a massive logistical problem that threatened to tear my entire trap apart before it even triggered. By draining the account down to exactly zero and routing the funds to an untraceable offshore entity, he had inadvertently triggered the bank fraud algorithms. The financial institution would view a sudden total withdrawal to a foreign shell company as a highly suspicious vulnerability. If the automated security system flagged the account as compromised, they would permanently close the account by the end of the business day to prevent further liability. This was the conflict that could ruin everything. I did not care about retrieving the stolen funds right now, but I desperately needed that exact checking account to remain open, active, and fully capable of receiving large incoming electronic transfers. The $850,000 payout from the commercial real estate developer was scheduled to land in that specific account on Friday morning. That money was the ultimate key to destroying my son. If the title company attempted to wire the real estate funds on Friday and my checking account was closed, the money would simply bounce back to the developer. If that happened, my son would be notified of the failure immediately. He would realize I had secretly intercepted the escrow instructions. He would panic, cancel his flight to Dubai, and slip through my fingers before the federal authorities could move in. I had to fix this immediately. I had to walk a razor-thin line. I needed to secure the checking account and keep it open for Friday, but I also had to make sure my son still believed I was broke, ignorant, and defeated. I turned the ignition key, putting the heavy truck into gear. The clock was ticking down to zero, and I had to outsmart my son without making a single sound. I did not call the police when I saw the zero balance on my phone. Calling the authorities over $12,000 would have triggered a standard financial investigation. Detectives would have frozen the pending sale of the house, and my son would have immediately realized he was under surveillance. He would have panicked, canceled his plans, and found a way to run before the real trap could close. I needed him to stay exactly where he was, comfortably believing he held all the cards and controlled my fate. I put my heavy work truck into gear and drove away from the bank parking lot. The $12,000 he stole was not a loss to me. It was a tactical investment. It gave me the perfect excuse to lock down the exact financial mechanism I needed to destroy him on Friday. Wednesday morning, the sky was heavy with dark gray clouds. I drove into the financial district and parked outside a massive brick building that housed the largest title and escrow company in the city. Most people only interact with title agents once or twice in their life when they buy a house. But I spent 30 years working as a commercial master plumber. I ran the underground water mains and the complex pipe systems for half the high-rise developments in the downtown sector. I knew the city contractors, the building inspectors, and the men who signed the massive development checks. The owner of this specific title company was an old friend named Richard. I had saved his primary commercial building from a catastrophic sewage flood 10 years ago. I worked 36 hours straight over a holiday weekend, waist deep in freezing water, to stop his ground floor server rooms from being destroyed. He owed me a massive favor, and he was a man who respected the quiet loyalty of hard work. I walked past the busy reception desk on the ground floor and went straight up the stairs to his private corner office. Richard looked up from a stack of legal files, surprised to see me. He immediately stood up and offered his condolences for Diane, but I cut the pleasantries short. I did not have time for sympathy. I sat down in the leather chair across from him and pulled my tablet from my coat pocket. I tapped the screen and slid it across his polished mahogany desk. I played the high-definition video from my kitchen security camera. Richard watched in absolute silence as my son meticulously forged my signature and stamped the fraudulent power of attorney. He watched Brooke hovering in the background, complaining about my antique furniture. When the video ended, Richard took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked sick to his stomach. He opened a thick manila folder on his desk. He told me the commercial developer had already submitted the rush paperwork yesterday afternoon using that exact forged document to legally authorize the sale of my home. Richard reached for his desk phone to call the authorities and report the real estate fraud. I reached across the desk and put my hand over the phone receiver. I told him not to call anyone. Richard looked at me completely confused. He said the sale was entirely illegal and the buyer contract had to be voided immediately before the property deed transferred. I told him I did not want to void the contract. I wanted the sale to go through exactly as scheduled. I wanted the developer to wire the $850,000 on Friday morning. I just needed to change the final destination of the money. I pulled out a printed copy of my banking information and laid it flat on the desk. I instructed Richard to legally override the wire transfer details my son had provided to the escrow account. My son had set up the escrow to release the real estate funds directly to his untraceable offshore shell company. I mandated that the entire $850,000 payout be wired exclusively into my personal primary checking account. It was the exact same account my son had just drained to zero the night before. Richard understood exactly what I was doing. He saw the cold calculation in my eyes, and he knew I was building a cage. Because I was the true legal owner of the property, and I was sitting right in front of him with my physical state identification, my new in-person instructions instantly nullified the forged power of attorney. Richard drafted a superseding addendum right there on his computer. He signed the escrow amendment and locked it deep into the secure banking system. The developer would wire the money on Friday morning, and it would bypass my son completely. But changing the destination was only the first half of the trap. I shook hands with Richard, left his office, and drove directly to my local bank branch. I bypassed the teller line and walked straight into the branch manager's office. I sat down and reported the unauthorized withdrawal of the $12,000 from the night before. I showed the manager the foreign routing details my son had used. The manager immediately panicked, just as I expected. He offered to close the compromised checking account right then and there to protect me from any further digital theft. I told him absolutely not. I explicitly ordered him to keep the account open and fully active to receive incoming electronic transfers. However, I instructed him to place a hard fraud freeze on the entire financial profile. I made him type the specific security codes into his terminal. That freeze meant money could drop into the account, but not a single cent could be wired out, transferred, or withdrawn electronically. The only way money could leave that account was if I was physically standing in the branch, providing my handwritten signature and a government identification. The bank manager typed the final commands into his system and hit the enter key. The heavy iron doors of the trap officially slammed shut. By Friday morning, the $850,000 from the house sale would drop safely into my frozen account. My son would be sitting at the airport waiting to electronically sweep those funds to Dubai, and he would hit a solid brick wall. He thought he had left me financially paralyzed and unable to fight back. He had no idea he had just handed me the keys to his own prison cell. Thursday afternoon arrived with a heavy gray sky pressing down on the city. The clock was ticking steadily toward Friday morning, and I was exactly where I needed to be. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was a text message from Cameron. He wanted me to meet him at a small local diner a few miles from the house. I knew exactly why he was reaching out. Criminals always feel the need to check the restraints on their victims before they pull the final lever. He wanted to look me in the eye and confirm that I was still broken compliant and entirely ignorant of his plans to flee the country. I put on my worn-out winter jacket and drove to the diner. The place smelled of burnt coffee and old frying oil. It was a local spot I used to visit years ago after long plumbing shifts. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back window. Cameron arrived 10 minutes late, intentionally making me wait to assert his dominance. He walked through the diner doors wearing a sharp navy blue suit that cost more than the car parked outside. He looked completely out of place among the tired workers and truck drivers. He slid into the booth across from me, refusing to take off his expensive wool overcoat. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply flagged down the waitress and ordered 2 black coffees. He leaned across the sticky table, resting his forearms on the edge. He put on a mask of fake sympathy, playing the role of the benevolent son forced to make tough decisions. He asked me in a slow, condescending tone if I had finished packing my tools in the garage. He told me the commercial developers were anxious to get the demolition crews scheduled, and he needed to make sure I was completely out of the property by Sunday night. I kept my posture slouched. I looked down at the table, avoiding his gaze. I played the part of the defeated old man perfectly. I told him the boxes were almost ready, and I promised I would not cause any delays. The visible rush of ego that washed over his face was disgusting. He truly believed he had beaten me into total submission. The waitress brought the 2 cheap coffees and set them down. Cameron took a sip, grimaced at the taste, and pushed the mug away. Then he reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his designer leather wallet. He extracted a crisp $50 bill and slid it across the table toward me. He tapped the paper money with his index finger. He told me to go buy myself some decent groceries for the weekend. He said he knew things were tight for me right now. This was the same man who had remotely drained $12,000 from my checking account the night before. He was tossing me $50 of his own money to feed his supreme arrogance while trying to leave me homeless. A younger man might have thrown the coffee in his face, but I just slowly reached out and picked up the bill. I folded it neatly and slipped it into my shirt pocket. I thanked him quietly. That simple act of submission sealed his complete false sense of security. He checked his heavy gold watch and signaled that he was ready to leave. It was time for me to drop the bait. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee and let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. I rubbed my temples with my calloused hands, acting like a confused widower overwhelmed by grief. I casually mentioned that I had been tearing Diane's home office apart all morning, trying to find a specific key. I mumbled about how my memory was failing me these days. Cameron stopped sliding out of the booth and settled back into the vinyl seat. He asked me what kind of key I was looking for, with a sharp edge of sudden suspicion in his voice. I kept my eyes focused on my coffee mug. I explained it was a small brass key with a serial number stamped on the settle. I told him it belonged to the private safety deposit box Diane kept at the downtown vault of the First National Bank. I shook my head slowly, wondering aloud why she was always so secretive about that specific box. I said I was worried because I could not remember if she kept the original physical property deeds or perhaps some handwritten amendments to the family trust inside it. I said I was planning to go down to the bank on Friday morning and have a locksmith drill the box open just to be safe before I moved into the assisted living facility. I finally looked up from my mug and watched the absolute terror wash over my son. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. His mind was racing to process the catastrophic implications of what I had just said. He had spent the last 2 weeks orchestrating a flawless digital takeover. He had forged the power of attorney. He had hijacked the escrow. He had stolen my liquid cash. But he had completely forgotten about the physical world. He realized that if an original updated trust document surfaced from a locked bank vault, it would instantly override his forged paperwork. It would halt the Friday morning real estate payout permanently. He frantically checked his watch. It was 4:15 in the afternoon. The First National Bank in the downtown financial district closed its vault access to the public at exactly 5 o'clock. The drive from this diner to the city center took at least 30 minutes in heavy afternoon traffic. He had a maximum of 15 minutes to get into his car, speed across town, flash his forged power of attorney to the bank manager, and drill that safety deposit box before the doors locked for the night. If he waited until tomorrow morning, I might get there first. He could not risk it. The panic completely hijacked his nervous system. He stood up so abruptly that his knees slammed into the underside of the heavy diner table, rattling the coffee mugs. He stammers a pathetic, broken excuse about an emergency conference call with his development team that he completely forgot about. He threw a crumpled $5 bill onto the table to cover the drinks. He did not even wait for me to say goodbye. He turned around and practically sprinted toward the diner exit, pushing past a waitress holding a tray of food. I sat perfectly still in the quiet booth. I listened to the diner door swing shut and the bell jingle. I looked out the window and watched his luxury sedan tear out of the parking lot, running a red light as he sped toward the highway. He was driving like a man running for his life. I took a slow, deep breath of the greasy air. I turned my head and looked across the table. In his absolute blind panic to beat the bank clock, he had made the one fatal mistake I was counting on. Sitting right there on the worn vinyl seat, abandoned and completely unprotected, was his heavy leather briefcase. It was the exact briefcase he carried everywhere, the briefcase that held his encrypted corporate laptop. He was so terrified of an imaginary safety deposit box that he left his actual criminal enterprise sitting right in front of me. I slid across the booth, grabbed the heavy leather handle, and walked out the back door of the diner. I stepped out into the cold alley behind the diner, holding the heavy leather handle. The air smelled of wet asphalt and rotting vegetables from the kitchen dumpsters. I walked quickly to my work truck parked near the edge of the lot. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors. I set the briefcase on the passenger seat. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. I knew my son was currently weaving through traffic in a blind panic, trying to reach a bank vault that held absolutely nothing. He had left his entire life sitting on the vinyl booth. I snapped the brass latches open. The briefcase smelled like expensive cologne and new leather. Inside, nestled in a velvet compartment, was his sleek silver corporate laptop. It was a high-end machine secured with military-grade encryption and biometric scanners. To anyone else, it would be an impenetrable brick. But I was not acting alone. Yesterday, when I met with my lawyer, I told him I needed a way to see exactly how deep the rot went inside my son's company. Fletcher had reached into his desk drawer and handed me a small black device. I pulled that small device from my shirt pocket. It was a specialized data extraction drive. Fletcher paid a private security firm a lot of money for tools like this. I did not need to know my son's password. I did not need his fingerprint. I opened the laptop screen just enough to access the side panel. I inserted the black drive into the port. A tiny green light on the edge of the plastic casing began to blink rapidly. The screen remained completely dark, but the internal fan began to whir. The extraction program bypassed the operating system entirely and began a brute force clone of the physical hard drive. I sat in the cold cab of my truck and watched the digital clock on my dashboard. Fletcher told me it would take exactly 3 minutes. Those were the longest 3 minutes of my life. I watched the entrance of the parking lot, expecting to see my son's luxury sedan come screeching back into the lot. He would eventually realize he left his bag. I just needed to finish before he did. The digital clock ticked forward. 2 minutes. 2.5 minutes. The tiny green light on the drive stopped blinking and turned solid. The clone was complete. I pulled the drive from the port and slipped it deep into my coat pocket. I used a microfiber cloth from my glove box to wipe away any fingerprints from the silver casing. I closed the laptop, slid it back into the velvet compartment, and snapped the brass latches shut. The briefcase looked exactly as it had sitting in the booth. I stepped out of my truck and walked back around to the front entrance of the diner. I pushed the glass door open. The afternoon lunch crowd had thinned out. The waitress who served us the coffee was wiping down the counter. I walked over to her and set the heavy leather briefcase on a stool. I put on a warm, apologetic smile. I told her my son had rushed out to an emergency meeting and accidentally left his work bag in our booth. I handed her a $20 bill and asked her to keep it safe behind the counter until he returned. She smiled, tucked the money into her apron, and placed the bag near the register. I walked out to my truck and drove away. 10 hours later, the city was completely asleep. I sat in the dark conference room of Fletcher's law firm. The only light came from the glow of a massive desktop monitor. Fletcher sat at the head of the long mahogany table, typing rapidly on a mechanical keyboard. The black extraction drive was plugged into a secure terminal. We were looking deep into the digital soul of my son's tech startup. The files were a chaotic mess of fabricated projections and desperate emails. We easily found the digital paper trail for the fraudulent bridge loan. The documents proving he used my house as illegal collateral were sitting in a folder labeled Urgent Liabilities. That alone was enough to send him to prison and save my property. But Fletcher did not stop there. He was a man who hunted for the absolute bottom of the barrel. He opened a hidden encrypted spreadsheet buried inside a system folder. Fletcher stopped typing. The silence in the conference room became incredibly heavy. He leaned closer to the monitor. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He turned the large screen toward me. He pointed to a series of outgoing wire transfers dated 3 months ago. They were routed from a corporate holding account directly into the operating budget of the failing startup. I asked him what I was looking at. Fletcher looked at me with a grim expression. He explained that those funds did not come from a bank. They did not come from an investor. My son had manually drained $400,000 from the employee pension fund. He had stolen the retirement savings of the very people who worked for him. He took the money from his developers, his secretaries, and his engineers to cover his own catastrophic business losses. He sacrificed their entire futures just to keep his own office doors open for a few more months. The reality of the crime settled over me like a suffocating blanket. My son was not just trying to steal from a grieving father. He was a predator, consuming everyone around him. The people he robbed were honest working families. They had mortgages and children. They trusted him with their livelihoods, and he slaughtered them financially without a second thought. This was no longer just a family dispute over a piece of real estate. This was a massive federal crime. Fletcher locked the terminal. He removed the drive and placed it into a heavy fireproof safe behind his desk. He told me that pension embezzlement is investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It carries mandatory minimum sentences that cannot be negotiated away. It guarantees complete asset seizure. The federal government would tear his life apart, brick by brick. I walked out of the office building and stood on the quiet city street. The cold night air filled my lungs. I reached into my pocket and felt the corner of the boarding pass receipt I had found at the storage unit. My son and his wife were planning to board a plane to Dubai tomorrow night. They thought they were going to escape the bridge loan default and live like royalty on the stolen equity of my house. They had absolutely no idea the gravity of the avalanche hanging over their heads. I got into my truck and drove home. Tomorrow was Friday. It was closing day, and the trap was fully armed. Friday morning arrived with a bitter chill that seeped through the floorboards of my heavy work truck. I was parked halfway down the block from the First National Bank in the downtown financial district. The engine was off and the heater was quiet. I sat in the driver's seat watching the heavy glass doors of the bank lobby through my windshield. The streets were busy with early morning commuters rushing to their offices, completely unaware of the absolute destruction that was about to unfold. I placed my tablet on the center console and opened two specific applications. The first application was a live satellite map. A small red dot blinked steadily near the international terminal of the city airport. Tuesday night, at the rundown storage facility, when Brooke violently shoved past me and her designer bag caught on the broken padlock, I did not just pick up her boarding pass. While she was busy cursing at me and trying to gather her spilled makeup, I took a small magnetic tracking device out of my pocket and slipped it deep into the silk lining of her purse. I had bought a bulk pack of those coin-sized trackers months ago to keep tabs on my expensive power tools at chaotic plumbing job sites. Now one of those cheap little devices was tracking the final movements of my son's criminal enterprise. I zoomed in on the map. The red dot was entirely stationary inside Terminal 3. I knew exactly where they were sitting. They were tucked away in the exclusive first-class departure lounge, drinking overpriced champagne and watching the digital clocks on the wall. Their expensive luggage was already checked. Their passports were sitting right on the table in front of them. They were just waiting for a single notification to pop up on their phones. They truly believed they had executed the ultimate betrayal without a single flaw. They thought I was sitting alone in my empty house packing my rusty wrenches into cardboard boxes, completely oblivious to the fact that they had sold the roof right over my head. I switched the tablet screen over to my secure banking application. It was exactly 9:55 in the morning. Richard, my old friend at the downtown title company, was a man who respected absolute punctuality. The commercial developer who bought my house had signed the final closing documents yesterday afternoon. The developer's funds were sitting quietly in a holding escrow, waiting for the legal trigger to release them. At exactly 10 o'clock, the automated banking system refreshed its daily ledger. I kept my eyes locked on the screen. The balance on my primary checking account suddenly changed. It went from $0 to exactly $850,000. The wire transfer from the title company had cleared perfectly. Richard had followed my superseding legal instructions to the letter. The massive payout completely bypassed the fraudulent escrow routing my son had established. The money never even got close to his untraceable offshore accounts. It landed securely under my name. But simply having this money safely in my account was not the final blow. I knew how my son operated. He was a creature of digital habit, and he left nothing to chance. He would not rely on manually logging into the bank to transfer the funds while sitting in a crowded airport lounge. He would have set up a customized automated script designed to immediately sweep the money out of my account the exact second it landed. He wanted to route those funds instantly to his shell company in the Caribbean, so there would be absolutely no delay in his escape to Dubai. I watched the screen waiting for his digital trap to trigger. It happened at exactly 10:15. A pending outgoing wire transfer appeared on my ledger for the full amount of $850,000. The destination was the exact same foreign routing number he had used to steal my $12,000 earlier in the week. His automated script was trying to aggressively pull the money out of my hands, but his script slammed directly into a solid brick wall. It hit the hard fraud freeze I had personally established with the branch manager on Wednesday morning. The internal banking algorithm instantly recognized a massive unauthorized foreign transfer attempt on a locked security profile. The screen on my tablet flashed a bright red error message. The transfer was instantly denied. The security hold remained active. The pending transaction simply vanished from the ledger, and the $850,000 dropped right back into my available balance. The money was trapped inside a digital vault, and I was the only person on Earth holding the physical key to open it. I sat back against the cold headrest of my truck and took a slow, deep breath. I could vividly imagine the chaotic scene unfolding 15 miles away in the luxury airport lounge. My son was probably staring down at his phone screen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. He would frantically try to refresh the banking application. He would try to run his automated transfer script a second time. He would angrily blame the airport wireless internet connection. But within a few short minutes, the cold, terrifying reality would finally sink into his bones. The money was not moving. He was scheduled to board a one-way flight out of the country tonight. He owed a ruthless commercial lender $1.2 million by the end of the business day. If he did not pay that bridge loan, the lender would file federal fraud charges against him before the sun went down. And the stolen equity he desperately needed to buy his freedom was permanently locked away. He had built a flawless machine to destroy me, but he had completely forgotten that I was the one who taught him how to use the tools. The panic was going to consume him, and I knew exactly where he was going to run next. The silence inside the cab of my truck was broken by the sudden vibration of my cell phone on the passenger seat. The screen lit up in the dim morning light. The caller identification displayed the name of my son. I picked up the device and pressed the green button to answer the call, but I did not say a single word. I just held the cold glass to my ear and listened. Cameron was no longer speaking with the smooth, arrogant tone of a wealthy tech executive. He was hyperventilating. His voice was high and tight with pure panic. He was practically screaming into the microphone, demanding to know what I had done to the checking account. The background noise on the call was loud, with the muffled sounds of a busy airport terminal. He was cursing wildly, asking why his automated transfer script had been rejected by the banking server. He told me he needed the money moved right this second and ordered me to fix whatever technical glitch was stopping the transaction. I listened to his desperate, frantic voice for exactly 10 seconds. I wanted to burn the exact sound of his collapsing ego into my memory. Then I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red button, and ended the call. I powered the device completely down and tossed it back onto the passenger seat. I did not need to be standing next to him to know exactly what he was doing in that airport lounge. Once the call dropped, he would immediately dial the toll-free customer service number for the First National Bank. I could picture him pacing back and forth across the expensive carpet of the first-class terminal, punching the numbers on his screen as fast as his fingers could move. He would navigate the automated voice menus, trying to force the system to manually authorize the wire transfer to his offshore shell company. He would punch in my social security number and my birth date using his cloned access to bypass the initial security prompts. But none of his stolen digital keys mattered anymore. The automated voice on the other end of the line would deliver a very clear and devastating message. The banking system would inform him that the account was completely locked. It would state that a hard fraud freeze had been activated due to suspicious international wire attempts. It would tell him that no funds could be moved electronically under any circumstances whatsoever. But the absolute worst part of that automated message was the final instruction it provided. The system would explicitly inform him that the freeze could only be lifted by the primary account holder standing physically inside a local branch with government-issued identification. He was 15 miles away, standing in an airport terminal, and the only physical key to his stolen fortune was sitting right in my pocket. While he was listening to that automated rejection, the overhead speakers in the luxury lounge would chime. The final boarding call for the morning flight to Dubai would echo through the terminal. The airline gate agents would be preparing to close the doors in less than 20 minutes. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him from every possible angle. He had a first-class boarding pass in his hand, but his digital pockets were completely empty. Brooke was not the kind of woman to tolerate failure or poverty. I knew exactly how she would react when she realized the plan had fallen apart. She would look at the sheer terror on his sweating face and she would know the money was gone. She would not offer him comfort or ask how they could fix the problem together. She would turn on him instantly. She had packed her expensive bags expecting to land in a luxury desert penthouse funded entirely by my stolen equity. When Cameron told her the wire transfer bounced and the bank account was locked, she would lose her mind. I knew she would start screaming at him right there in front of the other wealthy travelers. She would categorically refuse to get on a 14-hour flight to the Middle East without a single dollar to their names. She would tell him he was a complete, pathetic failure for letting an uneducated plumber outsmart him at the final hour. The alliance they built on greed and cruelty was fracturing under the extreme financial pressure. Cameron was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, and the clock was rapidly running out. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it in a matter of seconds. He could walk onto that airplane right now with his furious wife and fly across the world. But if he did that, he would land in a foreign country with absolutely no money, no income, and no way to survive. His tech company back home would collapse by the end of the day. The ruthless commercial lender would realize the house collateral was entirely fraudulent. They would file federal warrants for his arrest before his plane even touched down in Dubai. He would become an international fugitive with an empty wallet and nowhere to hide. Or he could stay and fight for the money. He could abandon the flight, abandon the escape plan, and try to force me to lift the bank freeze. His greed and his desperation were far too powerful to simply let the $850,000 go. He desperately needed that stolen equity to pay off the commercial bridge loan and keep himself out of a federal prison cell. I knew he was not going to get on that airplane. I looked down at the tablet resting on the center console of my truck. The digital tracking map confirmed everything I suspected. The small red dot representing the tracker I hid in his wife's purse stayed completely still inside the terminal. She was refusing to move. But a second later, I watched my son's phone signal detach from hers. The digital dot representing Cameron began to move rapidly across the screen. He was leaving the first-class lounge. He was running through the busy airport concourse, leaving his luggage and his angry wife behind. He was sprinting past the security checkpoints and heading straight for the ground transportation exit. He was going to jump into the first taxi he could find and tell the driver to speed straight to the downtown financial district. He was coming to the bank to find me. He actually believed he could still intimidate me into signing the release forms. He was rushing blindly into the absolute center of the trap. I picked up my tablet and stepped out of the cold truck. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my winter jacket. It was time to go inside the bank lobby and wait for my son to arrive. I sat in the plush leather chair inside the branch manager's office. The walls were made of floor-to-ceiling frosted glass, giving me a perfect view of the main lobby. The manager had stepped out to handle a commercial account, leaving me completely alone in the quiet room. I held a porcelain cup of black tea, letting the warmth seep into my calloused hands. The bank was a sanctuary of marble and polished wood. People spoke in hushed, respectful tones while waiting in neat, orderly lines. It was the absolute worst place for a desperate man to lose his mind. I watched the heavy revolving doors at the front entrance. I knew it would not be long. The drive from the airport to the financial district took exactly 28 minutes if you ignored every traffic law on the books. The heavy glass doors violently pushed open. Cameron stumbled into the lobby. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant tech executive who had tossed a $50 bill at me in the diner yesterday. His expensive custom suit was severely wrinkled and soaked with dark patches of sweat under the arms. His silk tie was pulled loose and hanging sideways across his chest. He looked like a hunted animal. He marched past the velvet ropes, completely ignoring the line of waiting customers and the sharp protests of the security guard. He scanned the massive room with wild, bloodshot eyes. He saw me sitting behind the glass wall. He did not bother to knock. He hit the heavy door of the office with his shoulder, forcing it open so hard the metal hinges screamed. The security guard rushed forward, but I simply raised my hand and waved the guard away. I wanted this conversation to happen in private. Cameron slammed the door shut behind him, locking the deadbolt with a loud click. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and slammed both of his palms down flat on the manager's mahogany desk. He leaned over the wood, his breath coming in ragged, heavy gasps. He smelled of stale airport coffee and pure, raw fear. He did not waste time with pleasantries or fake apologies. He demanded to know what kind of sick game I was playing. His voice was a harsh, raspy whisper designed to keep the bank tellers outside the glass from hearing him. He told me the commercial lender was already leaving automated voicemails on his phone, threatening to send auditors to the house by 5:00 this afternoon. He pulled a crumpled bank withdrawal slip from his pocket and threw it onto the desk. He ordered me to sign the release authorization right that second. He promised me he would let me stay in the basement of the house instead of the assisted living facility if I just gave him access to the $850,000. He was desperately trying to negotiate with a man he had already tried to financially execute. I did not look at his crumpled withdrawal slip. I set my teacup down on the porcelain saucer. The slight clinking sound seemed to echo in the tense room. I opened the inner pocket of my winter coat and pulled out a single sheet of heavy white paper. I had printed it early this morning at Fletcher's law firm. I placed it flat on the mahogany desk, right next to his trembling hands. I used my index finger to slowly slide the paper across the polished wood until it rested directly under his eyes. I told him I was not signing any bank release forms today. I told him he needed to read what was on the paper before he made another empty threat. Cameron looked down at the document. It was not a bank form. It was a printed summary of the hidden encrypted ledger. Fletcher and I had extracted from his cloned hard drive the night before. The bold black numbers at the top detailed the exact sum of $400,000. Below that total was an itemized list of every single employee pension account he had illegally drained over the last 3 months. I watched his eyes scan the page, reading the names of his own developers and secretaries whose futures he had stolen. The arrogant fire in his gaze extinguished instantly. The remaining color drained completely out of his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. The silence inside the glass office became absolutely deafening. I watched the gears turning in his head as he processed the sheer magnitude of his failure. He realized I did not just stumble into his real estate fraud by accident. He realized I had been actively hunting him, tracking his every move, and dismantling his life piece by piece. The $850,000 from the house sale was never going to be his to spend. The escape flight to Dubai was completely gone. But worse than all of that, he finally understood that the federal government was about to rip his entire existence apart. Pension embezzlement carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. He was looking at a decade behind concrete walls. His tech company, his custom suits, his expensive cars, and his unearned pride all evaporated in the span of 10 seconds. The human brain can only process so much catastrophic loss before the primal instincts take over completely. He had no leverage left to use against me. He had no money to bribe his way out. He had no escape route to run toward. The only thing left inside his empty shell of a body was violent, unpredictable rage. He let out a terrible sound that was half sob and half scream. He swept his arm across the mahogany desk, shattering the porcelain teacup against the glass wall and scattering the pens across the floor. Then he planted his expensive leather shoes deep into the carpet and lunged his entire body across the wide desk. His hands reached out with his fingers, curled like hooks, aiming directly for my throat. Cameron launched his body across the polished wood of the desk. His hands were reaching aggressively for my neck. I did not flinch. I did not raise my arms to block him. I knew I did not have to do a single thing. Before his fingers could even graze the fabric of my coat, the heavy frosted glass door behind him swung violently open. It hit the adjacent wall with a loud thud that made the entire room vibrate. Cameron froze mid-motion. His physical momentum completely died. He lost his balance and crashed awkwardly onto the edge of the mahogany desk. He scrambled backward, breathing heavily, and turned around to face the doorway. Fletcher stepped into the room. My lawyer was not wearing his usual courtroom suit. He wore a dark trench coat and held a thick leather binder under his arm. He looked at my son with the kind of absolute disgust usually reserved for something scraping the bottom of a shoe. But Fletcher did not come alone. 3 men walked into the glass office right behind him. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. They wore identical dark gray suits and solid blue ties. They did not look like bank security guards or local police officers. They had federal badges clipped directly to their belts. They were agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in white-collar financial crimes. The lead agent stepped forward and closed the office door, cutting off the sudden gasps and murmurs from the bank tellers in the main lobby. The atmosphere in the room dropped 10 degrees. I watched the remaining color completely drain from the face of my son. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grip the edge of the desk to keep himself from collapsing onto the carpet. He looked at the agents, and then he looked at Fletcher. His mind was finally processing the sheer scale of the operation I had built around him. Fletcher walked over to the desk and calmly explained the terrifying reality of the situation. He told Cameron that the federal agents had not just magically appeared after a quick phone call. They had been sitting inside the main secure conference room down the hall since 8 o'clock this morning. They had been drinking coffee and using the secure fiber optic network of the bank to cross-reference the cloned hard drive data directly with the federal database. They had verified every single stolen pension fund dollar by tracing the routing numbers hidden in his encrypted laptop. They had also watched his automated offshore wire transfer attempt trigger the bank fraud freeze in real time just 20 minutes ago. They had him cornered from every possible financial and legal angle. The lead agent, took a step closer to Cameron. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clinking sound echoed loudly in the quiet office. He told my son that he was being placed under federal arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny. He started reading him his rights in a flat, practiced voice. That was the exact moment the last shred of my son's fake dignity completely vanished into thin air. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not accept his fate like a man. He completely broke down. He started stammering uncontrollably. He backed away from the federal agent, holding his hands up in a desperate defensive gesture. He pointed a shaking finger through the glass walls toward the main street outside. He started shouting that they had the wrong person. He claimed he was just a clueless technology developer who did not understand complex financial laws. Then he committed the ultimate act of pathetic cowardice to save his own skin. He blamed his own wife. He told the federal agents that Brooke was the real mastermind behind the entire criminal enterprise. He spoke incredibly fast, tripping over his own words as he desperately tried to rewrite history. He said Brooke was the one who found the offshore shell companies in the Caribbean and forced him to use them. He claimed she was the one who stole the brass notary stamp from my house and hired a professional forger to fake the power of attorney. He said she managed all the escrow accounts and booked the first-class tickets to Dubai without his permission. He said she constantly threatened to divorce him and destroy his company if he did not comply with her demands. He threw the woman he had promised to love and protect directly under the bus without taking a single breath. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair and watched him beg. It was the most pathetic display I had ever witnessed in my 63 years of life. He was willing to send his own wife to a federal prison just to buy himself a few more hours of freedom. The federal agents did not look impressed by his sudden confession. They had spent their entire careers listening to arrogant thieves blame everyone else for their crimes when the walls finally closed in. The lead agent did not even blink. He just finished reading the rights, took another deliberate step forward, and grabbed my son's right wrist. Cameron tried to pull his arm away, but the agent was incredibly strong. He twisted my son's arm behind his back and snapped the first steel cuff around his wrist. The cold metallic click was sharp and final. Cameron started crying loudly. Real tears spilled down his cheeks, ruining his expensive cologne and his tailored suit. He looked at me over his shoulder as the agent secured his other hand. He begged me to tell them it was all a massive misunderstanding. He called me Dad for the first time in years and asked me to fix it, just like I used to fix his broken toys when he was a little boy. I did not stand up from the chair. I did not offer him a single word of comfort or sympathy. I just looked at him with cold, empty eyes. I told him he broke this toy completely on his own, and nobody in the world was going to put it back together for him. The agents patted him down with rough efficiency. They reached into his pockets and removed his designer wallet, his heavy gold watch, and the electronic keys to his luxury sedan. They confiscated his cell phone, placing it inside a static-proof evidence bag. They treated him like a common street criminal, because that is exactly what he had chosen to become. The bank manager returned and stood outside the glass door watching the entire arrest unfold with wide eyes. The lobby had gone completely silent. Every customer and teller had stopped what they were doing to watch the wealthy, arrogant executive weep in federal custody. Cameron hung his head in absolute shame as the lead agent grabbed him by the shoulder. His grand escape plan had ended in total humiliation. He had walked into the bank expecting to bully a grieving father into surrendering a fortune. Instead, he was leaving in steel chains, and his nightmare was only just beginning. The frosted glass door of the office was still hanging open. The echoes of my son's pathetic weeping had barely settled into the carpet when the main entrance of the bank lobby burst open for a second time. I looked past the federal agents and watched Brooke march through the velvet ropes. She was dragging a massive designer suitcase behind her. The small wheels scraped harshly against the polished marble floor. She looked completely unhinged. Her expensive airport outfit was rumpled, and her face was flushed red with absolute rage. She had just realized the flight to Dubai was taking off without them. She had abandoned the first-class lounge run through the terminal and paid a cab driver $200 to speed her into the financial district. She came to the bank expecting to find her husband holding a certified check for $850,000. Instead, she walked right into the middle of a federal takedown. She froze in the center of the lobby. Her eyes darted from the armed agents in the dark suits to the steel handcuffs tightly securing her husband's wrists behind his back. But the absolute shock of the scene did not silence her. It amplified her anger. She had walked in at the exact moment Cameron was loudly begging the lead agent for a plea deal. She heard his desperate, trembling voice echoing through the quiet bank. She heard him use her name. She stood completely still as she listened to the man she married tell the Federal Bureau of Investigation that she was the criminal mastermind who orchestrated the entire real estate fraud. The fragile alliance they had built on shared greed and arrogance shattered into a million irreversible pieces right there on the marble floor. Brooke did not cry. She did not rush forward to comfort him or ask what was happening. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, absolute hatred. She let go of her heavy suitcase and let it crash to the ground. She walked directly into the glass office, ignoring the federal agents who instinctively stepped forward to block her path. She looked at Cameron with a level of disgust that made the air in the room feel heavy. She told him he was the most pathetic excuse for a man she had ever met. Cameron tried to backtrack immediately. He stammered frantically, trying to apologize and explain that he was just confused and scared. But Brooke did not care about his apologies. She operated purely on self-preservation. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her cell phone. She knew exactly what she needed to do to save herself from taking the fall for his catastrophic failures. She unlocked the screen and opened a hidden encrypted messaging application. She did not hand the phone to her husband. She walked right past him and handed the device directly to the lead federal agent. She told the agent to read the message thread from last Monday night. The agent took the phone and scrolled through the glowing screen. Brooke narrated the evidence out loud for everyone in the room to hear. She pointed out the exact timestamps where Cameron explicitly ordered her to search my house for the brass notary stamp while I was asleep. She showed the agent the digital photographs Cameron had taken of his practice forgeries, comparing them to my real signature. She revealed text messages where he laid out the exact plan to hijack the escrow funds and route them to the Caribbean shell company. She laid out his entire premeditated criminal conspiracy in undeniable high-definition text. She completely destroyed whatever tiny shred of reasonable doubt he had left. The lead agent read the messages and nodded slowly. He handed the phone to a secondary agent to bag as physical evidence. Cameron slumped forward, his spirit completely broken. He had tried to throw his wife to the wolves, and she had responded by wrapping the federal noose tightly around his neck. But Brooke was too blinded by her own venom to realize she was standing in the exact same trap. The lead agent turned his attention away from my son and looked directly at her. He informed her that providing evidence against her husband did not erase her own complicity in the crime. She had actively participated in the attempted theft of my property. She had aided in the international wire fraud conspiracy. The agent demanded her travel documents immediately. Brooke hesitated, her arrogance finally cracking under the weight of federal authority. She slowly reached into her purse and handed over her passport. The agent placed it into the evidence bag right next to the passport they had confiscated from Cameron. He told them both that their names were officially flagged in the national database. They were permanently grounded. Neither of them would be leaving the city, let alone the country. The agents grabbed Cameron by the shoulders and hauled him up from the floor. They began to march him out of the glass office toward the waiting federal vehicles parked on the street outside. Brooke was left standing alone in the center of the room. Her grand escape to a luxury desert penthouse had dissolved into absolute nothingness. Her credit cards were linked to the frozen bank accounts and the collapsing tech startup. Her husband was on his way to a federal holding cell. She had absolutely no money, no resources, and nowhere to go. She slowly turned around and looked at me sitting calmly in the leather chair. The venom was completely gone from her eyes, replaced by a pathetic, desperate panic. She realized she was stranded in the downtown financial district with a heavy suitcase and an empty wallet. She took a hesitant step toward me. She actually opened her mouth and begged me for a favor. She asked if I could give her some cash to pay for a cab ride back to the house so she could figure out what to do next. She wanted me, the man she had just tried to leave homeless and destitute, to fund her retreat. I stood up from the leather chair. I buttoned my winter coat and picked up my tablet from the mahogany desk. I walked toward the open glass door. Brooke stepped into my path, holding her hand out, with a pathetic, pleading expression. I did not look at her face. I reached into my shirt pocket. I pulled out the crisp $50 bill that Cameron had arrogantly slid across the diner table yesterday afternoon to buy my groceries. I held the paper money up in the air. The bank manager was standing just outside the office door, watching the chaotic scene with wide, nervous eyes. I walked right past Brooke, ignoring her outstretched hand completely. I stopped in front of the manager. I placed the $50 bill directly into his palm. I thanked him for his hospitality and told him the money was a tip for the excellent black tea. Then I turned my back on the wreckage of my son's life and walked out of the bank lobby, leaving Brooke standing completely alone in the silent room. I had barely taken 5 steps toward the main exit when the heavy revolving doors spun wildly again. A large man in a loud checkered sport coat pushed his way into the lobby. His face was purple with rage. It was the commercial real estate developer my son had made the backroom deal with. He was clutching a thick stack of legal documents and screaming into his cell phone. I knew exactly who he was talking to. Richard from the title company had just called him to deliver the bad news. The developer hung up the phone and started shouting at the bank tellers. He demanded to speak to the branch manager immediately. He yelled that his real estate contract had just been voided by the city clerk because the power of attorney used to sell the property was a confirmed criminal forgery. He did not care about my son or the federal arrest that had just taken place. He only cared about his money. He pounded his fist on the marble counter, demanding the immediate return of his $850,000. He threatened to sue the bank, the escrow company, and anyone else standing in his way. I turned around and walked calmly back toward the center of the lobby. I approached the furious developer and told him to lower his voice. I introduced myself as the true legal owner of the property he had tried to purchase out from under me. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and anger. I told him he was not going to need a lawyer because his money was perfectly safe. I signaled to the bank manager, who was still clutching my $50 tip. We walked back into the frosted glass office. I sat down at the mahogany desk one last time. The manager pulled up my locked checking account on his terminal. The $850,000 was sitting right there, entirely untouched by my son's greedy hands. Because I was the primary account holder and the funds were frozen under my direct physical control, I had the absolute authority to send the money back. The manager printed a single-wire reversal authorization form. I picked up a pen and signed my real signature at the bottom of the page. It felt incredibly satisfying to write my own name after watching my son forge it so easily. The manager pressed a button, and the massive sum of money instantly left my account, returning safely to the developer's escrow holding. The developer watched the confirmation screen from the doorway. He let out a massive breath of relief and walked out of the bank without saying a single word of thanks. I did not care. My house was completely free and clear. The fraudulent deed transfer was permanently destroyed. I walked out of the office and looked through the massive front windows of the bank. Out on the busy street, the federal agents were pushing my son into the back of a black government vehicle. His head was pushed down to avoid hitting the doorframe. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, locking him in a dark cage. He was facing a minimum of 15 years in federal prison for the pension embezzlement alone. The fraudulent bridge loan and the real estate forgery would likely add another decade to his sentence. He was going to grow old behind concrete walls. Inside the lobby, things were getting worse for his wife. Brooke had tried to quietly pick up her heavy suitcase and sneak out the side door while I was handling the wire reversal. But she did not make it far. 2 more federal agents who had stayed behind to process the scene stepped directly into her path. They did not let her leave. They informed her that she was being officially detained for questioning regarding her direct involvement in the international wire fraud conspiracy. They took her designer suitcase and her expensive leather purse. They read her rights right there in the middle of the bank. She started to cry, but it was not out of remorse. It was the selfish, panicked crying of a woman who realized her life of luxury was completely over. She had married a man for his wealth and helped him plot the absolute ruin of an innocent father. Now they were both left with absolutely nothing. No house, no money, no tech startup, and no flight to the Middle East. They were stripped bare and exposed to the harsh light of the federal justice system. I pulled my winter coat tight against the chill and walked out through the revolving glass doors. I stepped onto the sidewalk and breathed in the crisp morning air. The city noise washed over me, but I felt completely at peace. I walked to my truck, climbed inside, and put the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I had one final piece of business to attend to, and it was time to leave this broken family behind forever. Saturday morning brought a thick layer of white frost that covered the entire neighborhood. The street was dead quiet. The luxury cars and the moving trucks were completely gone. I stood in the driveway next to my heavy work truck. The engine was already idling, sending plumes of white exhaust into the freezing air. Fletcher pulled his dark sedan up to the curb. He did not wear a suit today. He wore a heavy wool sweater and carried a thick manila folder. He walked up my driveway and placed the folder flat directly onto the cold metal hood of my truck. There were no buyers coming to the house today. There was no commercial developer waiting for keys.